Okay, we're going to demonstrate how you can use the namespacing versioning for your URI. Remember, in Django, every time you create your application, you have the URI configuration on usually the file url.py. So we want to make sure that we version this URL so that a user can use the same URL with different version, something like a v1 slash policy, v2 slash policy. So as I pointed out in the previous video, we'll be using the versioning from ResFramework. So we'll be using the versioning package from ResFramework. So let's go ahead and version our application. So to version our application, to version our URL, we need to make sure that we have we can version our application directly from the view set, using the class the property versioning class. So we can directly version this view set by importing the specific scheme. In this case, we'll be importing from ResFramework versioning imports NameSpaceVersioning. We can directly apply the NameSpaceVersioning for this particular policy view set. This is just an example to demonstrate how we can version our URL. As the name suggests, we'll be using the namespace versioning. So in Django, the concept of namespace on the URL apply when your URL may have the next property called namespace. Something here. So which should not be applied here on the application URL, should be applied on the project URL, the global URL where Django collects all the URL configuration for this project. Okay, so we can either, as I was saying, we can either use the namespace versioning directly here on our view set, or we can configure the namespace versioning globally using Django REST framework. So let's go ahead and configure the we got configure Django REST framework so that we can apply and call so this dictionary is responsible for setting or configuring as you may already know, for configuring the REST framework. So so to namespace our URL, this URL with different version using the namespace versioning scheme, we need to use the class, define the class that will be the default scheme or default versioning class, and in this instance we're using framework versioning class name space versioning, and the default version, in this case we can, v.01, and the default version will be the default version that will be on each request. On request version, the default will be v1 dots. If we don't pass any version on our request, or Django will consider as if we are using the default versioning. Okay, so the next property or key configuration we need to apply is the allow version. And as soon as we set the allow version, and this should be a set or a dictionary, v1.1 and v2.0. As soon as we set this key allow version, only a set of value in this sets will be considered as valid version when you issue a request. If you issue a request without any of this value, this class namespace versioning will throw an error telling you that the version you specify in your URL does not exist. The next one is the version parameter. So usually when we issue the request, this scheme namespace versioning will automatically add version with the specific value. So the version param specify which label, which name that will be carrying our versioning. So we can just pass version, and that's all we need to do to configure the namespace versioning on global setting. As I say, we can also configure that per view set, but that's a topic for another tutorial where we'll be talking about the query parameter versioning. So now that we configure our versioning, let's try something. Let's test something. So as you can see, we are going to test this URL. We want to make sure that this reverse function we are calling on namespace v1 with the application policy will return a valid URL. Test URL test policy URL. Just gonna print self policy URL v1. Okay, as you can see on top, I'm just describing the way the URL comes in when you issue a request to the server. So the URL or dispatcher, um, the URL dispatcher in Django check, make sure that the URL is valid, and so it does that by checking into your app URL and using the namespace of the application, which is just the name of the application, and the instance namespace. So this video is based on the instance namespace that the scheme, the class namespace versioning leverage to namespace each one of your requests. Let's run the test and see what's gonna happen if we wanna get the version 1. We wanna reverse the URL name from namespace v1.0 or v1.1. So Python manage test policy. Okay, we got an error. So yeah, it's always good to test anything in Django. By the way, that's the way I always start all my testing or my application Django. Even if I want to create the simplest view that I can offer or deliver, I will just always start by URL. What is the URL look like? What's gonna be the view like? And then create model, and then expect sort of a response from that view set or a simple view. So as you can see, we got an error here. The namespace v1 is now defined, but we have different namespace here. We have the v1.0, v1.1. Why it's not defined? Well, it's not defined because although we have already set the expected version that our scheme namespace versioning should receive when we issue a request, we do not yet set the namespace on URL because this scheme manage the namespace on the URL using Django concept namespace instance and the namespace application namespace. Okay, so to do so, we have to import our application or URL configuration here. Policy include policy URL, and we need to pass the namespace v1.0, and let's see what's gonna happen. So we got an error here. It looks like our setting is not correct. Default version class, it's now defined, so the module or the package versioning is not correct. So we got fix that. It's versioning. Okay, we got a new error. Guys, I like this error. A lot of people struggles with this error. So as you can see, specifying a namespace in include without providing an app is not supported. So when we specify a namespace here without providing the app name, so the app name is called the application namespace. So Django recommends set the app name attribute in an include module, which the include module is this one. So we can just set the app name, something like a app name. Policy in this case. And the app name here is called the application namespace, which is just the name of the application. And it's also say, so we have two alternatives here. One, we either set the app name attribute in the include module, or we pass a two tuple containing the list of pattern and the app instead. We can either use this choice, this option. So let's test again our URL to see if it's valid. So v1 is now register namespace. So we got v1 here. So when we're running our test is trying to define this variable, but v1.1 is now a register namespace. So we need to register that also as a new namespace. We can just duplicate this one. And to make sense of that, we can just, let's say, 1, 2, and we define and we pass a new value for this namespace. So these are called instance namespace. So instance namespace is the instance of application namespace, which distinguish two URL that have the same configuration. Let's test again. There we go. Now we have our first valid URL, as you can see, but even if we didn't specify that correctly, actually we should finish the path with the / to make it clear. There we go. That's a valid URL. Of course, you wouldn't use 1 and 2. With namespace, the emphasis is more on the namespace value than the configuration URL. But Django recommends that you pass, you hard code your URL with the value of the namespace, so you can make sense of what's the user will be expecting from that URL. So let's test again. So we have our first URL, and if you want to print the second one, we can also print second one. Policy v2. There we go. That's the way we can configure the namespace versioning in Django REST framework using the scheme namespace versioning, which pretty much just leverage the concept of namespacing in Django to map the namespace a value from your URL onto the request. And to see the request, the result of the request, let's go on the view here. So as you can see, let's see our view. Our view, the gate is handled by list. So we can implement list here. List as a request. Arguments and keyword arguments, and so we wanna print the current version of the URL. So we can just get that from request version, and of course we need to retain a sort of a response from Django HTTP inputs response. Yeah, we can retain HTTP response. That means data. Yeah, this is the response. So behind the scene, the list or retain a response, we can either overwrite the parents list by by implementing the list by itself using super, but I'm just retaining a response here because list expects a response to be retained. So to see the version, we need at least to issue a request somewhere. So let's create another test case here, test policy, request, response equal self client get self policy v1, and then we print the response contents. Pretty basic, so we are going to test policy. There we go. So the request is sending. So the request, every time we issue a request with namespace v1, Django is automatically passing adding version in the request with the value of the request. Unfortunately, the data is not what we expect to be. Let's do something. Oh, I see what's happening. This is the response. Yeah, just simple response. We're not using a JSON response here, so I was passing the JSON response. Yeah, so this is the response, as you can see. Pretty simple, I just wanted to demonstrate the way you can capture your request, and from here you can even switch. You can also implement the get serializer class, so you can switch between two serializer. When the version is v1, the response can be customized when the version is v2, and then customize your response. Okay, that's all for today. On the next video I will show you how to use the query parameter versioning scheme in Django REST framework. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.